Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world, welcome back to The Caring Economy with me, Toby Usnik. We're now in our 14th season, and I'm really pleased today to have as our guest Rebecca Williford. She's the president and CEO of Disability Rights Advocates. They are the only national nonprofit legal center focused on disability rights impact litigation. Today, we're going to hear a lot about disability and disability rights, but particularly it's exciting because we're going into the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disability Act and celebrating that later this summer. So I want to just acknowledge that Rebecca's had this incredible journey from a legal fellow to a CEO of DRA and is an inspiring testament to dedication and expertise in advancing the rights of people with disabilities. So let's dive right into it, Rebecca. Welcome to the Caring Economy.
Thank you so much, Toby, for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today and to be talking to your listeners.
And I think we have to give a shout out to our mutual friend and colleague, Julian Leon. We met at a Goldman Sachs institutional clients event earlier this year and got to sit together at lunch and get to get acquainted, right?
We did, absolutely. So thank you, Julian. Thank you. You've been a wonderful connector.
He really is the real deal. So what we usually do, Rebecca, at the beginning of each session, we ask the guest to give us maybe a 2 or 4 minute digest of their life, where they came from, how they found their way, maybe mentors or bumps or pivots along the way. So why don't you give us a quick overview of your life story?
So I will tell you that becoming a lawyer and running a national nonprofit legal center was never the plan. Disability was the furthest thing from my mind until it became exactly what I wanted to do and what I'm very, very motivated and driven to do today. So how did I get there? So I was born and raised in North Carolina. I grew up there. I was a competitive swimmer and a runner. And then as a teenager, I acquired my disability, and I'll get into how that impacted my career. But grew up in North Carolina. After going to college and law school in North Carolina, I moved to Berkeley, and that was 15 years ago. And as a teenager, I my disability evolved throughout high school. I had countless medical appointments. I missed a lot of school, hospitalization. It turns out that I have a neurological disorder that was pretty difficult to diagnose and required a lot of time in the healthcare system. And I went from had this experience of going from having a non-apparent disability where it was just difficult to walk around to the point where I couldn't walk around and I became a wheelchair user. And, at that point in my life, no one really told me about disability rights and civil rights. I was only, often the only disabled person or one of a few in the room. And it was hard to find mentors who had similar experiences. And that sort of drove me to start exploring other places in the country where I might want to live. So I started during law school doing summer internships in different parts of the country in disability rights work. And I spent a summer at Disability Rights Advocates in Berkeley, and I loved it. It wasn't humid. Like I got away from that North Carolina humidity, and it didn't snow. There was such a wonderful, eclectic disability community, and we had the whole history of the disability rights movement. And so I fell in love with it, and and I'm still here to this day.
Can you say more about what the neurological disorder is and how common it is, or what our listeners might need to know or should know about it?
Sure. So I have my disability is called dysautonomia, and it means that I have to use a wheelchair. And I think what's a lot more interesting to me as a disabled person, rather than delving into sort of medical specifics, how I have incorporated disability as part of my identity. When you're going through the experience of becoming disabled, it's very much or can be an experience with the medical system. But then you realize there is a disability community, and the focus is very much on empowerment and making the world more accessible. And that's exactly what we do at at DRA, and we're
Mhm.
literally changing the landscape of what it means to be a disabled person in this country and try to navigate basic, things from point A to point B.
When this was happening in your life, this movement toward a more disabled person, what were your peers like in school? What were your parents like? How it must have been so challenging at times, but I'm sure you also had really magical moments where people stepped up and surprised you, but I don't want to project.
So my experience of really seeing how hard my parents and I had to advocate on so many fronts really sort of informed my experience. It was often I was seeing how hard they were having to advocate and how hard other sort of teenagers who were newly disabled were having to advocate for themselves. So it
Mm.
was usually in a medical center setting. People who were going through similar experiences of trying to navigate the world. That just all exposed me to this completely new universe, and one where so much advocacy for the most basic rights was desperately needed. And that really ignited something in me. I thought about all the different ways that I might be part of that advocacy. I couldn't stop thinking about all that I'd been exposed to and all that needed to happen in society to level the playing field for people with disabilities. And that's, when I really began to fully embrace disability as part of my identity that I was truly proud of. And thinking back to high school, I was so sick at my high school graduation. I'm a W, I'm at the end of the alphabet, but they called my name first because I could only be there for a very short period of time. And that was sort of, during the height of things. So there, were moments where you see humanity, and kindness, and, I got a standing ovation for, graduating high school. And, I'll never forget moments like that. There were friends that were taking notes for me, and there was my mom who was, I was too weak to write calculus, but I was dictating my calculus to her, and she was learning all the jargon and learning, to be my scribe and that. So there are lots of people that helped along the way. There are also lots of challenges. The medical system can be pretty tough to navigate when things aren't straightforward. There are lots of challenges there.
So
Uh,
hopefully we're going to hear in this course, this interview, how some things like digital technology and just awareness have improved things. Tell us about DRA and just the whole mission and history of it and why you're so proud to be there.
DRA's history is really intertwined with the ADA passage that happened in 1990. And our founders, Sid Walensky and Larry Paradis, recognized the need. So it was great to have the ADA on the books. So the ADA is this robust federal statute, and it is a recognition by Congress that discrimination against people with disabilities is so rampant that we needed a federal statute that would build on the existing federal statutes,
Mhm.
that would protect people with disabilities in all spheres of life. So employment, technology, um, you name it. The promise of the ADA is that people with disabilities would be fully integrated into all aspects of life. But if no one is enforced the way the ADA was written, it needed to be enforced by people with disabilities. And the way to do that is through litigation. So there was an incredible burden put on disabled people to enforce this law that was on the books.
Mhm.
And our founders saw that, and they saw it in a really unique way when it came to systemic barriers. And when I talk about systemic barriers, that's sort of not individuals, needing, assistance with very individualized legal claims, but it's, entire systems that are not accessible. So entire sidewalk systems that aren't
Mhm.
accessible. Um, Subway systems that aren't accessible,
Mhm.
education systems that aren't providing special ed in the right way. DRA was started a few years after the ADA was passed in Berkeley, with the history of the disability rights movement. beginning in Berkeley in this country, it was the perfect place for DRA to open its doors. And we're the legal arm of the disability community when it comes to fighting systemic discrimination. And today we are a 30-person nonprofit legal center, and we have expanded beyond Berkeley. Our focus has always been nationwide, but um, we have offices in Berkeley, and New York City and Chicago today, and we represent people with all types of disabilities all over the country. So, not just people like me who use wheelchairs, but people with mental health disabilities, people who are deaf, people who are blind, people with learning disabilities.
Mhm.
We're the biggest minority group that anybody can join at any time. As I learned as a teenager, we have open enrollment. It's not a threat. We're a really fun group, but this disability is this very, very intersectional minority that's just um, that's a very, very big group. And so our cases over the years we've done cases in Hawaii, Alaska, Boston, points in between. More recently, we've done some cases in North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and we team up with local counsel when we're not operating in one of the home office based states. So
I didn't know. Why is Berkeley considered the home of the disability rights movement?
So we could do a whole other podcast on this when you want to. But Berkeley has such a rich history. Folks like Ed Roberts, folks like Judy Heumann were in Berkeley during a really pivotal period, in this country's history. Ed Roberts was, a disabled person who was, trying to navigate, being independent and going to UC Berkeley and running into barriers. Judy Heumann was here, who, recently passed away. And there was a lot of political action around sort of making society more accessible. Um, and we have the first Center for Independent Living that's in Berkeley,
Got it.
and that was all there was just a lot of energy. I think a lot about, as somebody who grew up in North Carolina when other parts of the country were dealing with different, parts of the civil rights movement. Berkeley was, really, really ahead of the
Got it.
curve in terms of disability.
Got it.
Um,
And what are some of the examples of cases that you're working on now? Are they similar to ones that you've been working on in the past 15 years, or are there new things afoot, like, I don't know, I'm just brainstorming, like AI or um, immigration? I mean, the intersectionality you talk about, I'm sure has to also be part of that conversation as well. But what are some of the bigger lawsuits you're working on now?
Also, when I'm using the word impact litigation, people are like, well, why is it so great? What does that do?
Yeah,
So I can start by explaining just
please.
a little, just giving a little more background on that. And I think, when we're talking about impact litigation, we're talking about moving mountains and creating social change. And 99% of the time, the biggest barriers are only going to be fixed with a court order. And the reason for that is because accessibility, sadly, is often not the first thing on the mind of businesses, municipalities, et cetera,
Right.
when they're thinking about building structures and systems. And people with disabilities are often overlooked. And if accessibility isn't baked in, it's can be really expensive to tack it on. And you need a judge often to say the entity needs to fix certain barriers by a certain date. And if not, you'll be back in court. So it's really about accountability and enforcing the law. And at least at DRA, for folks who are a little squeamish about litigation, everything always starts with a letter. And sometimes entities come to the table and they want to work out an agreement with us immediately. And we love that. That's wonderful. I had examples of companies like Starbucks where we've done that over the years, and they fixed their counter height issues many, many years ago with just a letter. But for a lot of the biggest barriers and for a lot of entities, it takes litigation and lawsuits to get those mountains moved. So what has impact litigation at DRA done for this country? So a few of the highlights are colleges, because of our case against Stanford, colleges across the country are starting to provide accommodations to students with mental health disabilities rather than telling them they've got to leave campus because of their disability. Another example is juvenile detention facilities. They're starting to do a better job providing special ed and support to youth with disabilities who are incarcerated rather than putting them in solitary confinement, pepper spraying them. Streaming services, you talked about technology. Streaming services are providing more audio description for people who are blind. Healthcare providers are doing a better job providing interpreters to deaf people so they can have effective communication at their appointments, at medical appointments and procedures. And then emergency preparedness. So cities are required to have emergency preparedness plans that actually, ensure that disabled people aren't left behind in emergency responses. And we've done a lot of work throughout the country around that. And today, one of the issues that's, forefront on my mind, is, access to the voting system. We're an election year. This is huge, and folks with disabilities are often facing barriers when they go to vote. Our voting work has been going on for probably at least 15 years at DRA with barriers that disabled people were facing, when they went to the polls. So you had a mobility disability, it would be, the issue is that, the polling place wasn't, physically accessible. You couldn't get in to vote. And then for people who are blind, there's great assistive technologies that enable them to, read print materials independently and vote. But often, the machines weren't working, or, the staff weren't quite sure how to use them. And then when COVID hit, and the focus really moved to an absentee voting system and how to make that accessible for people who are blind. And our focus has really stayed there since that time. So we've looked at we've improved systems in North Carolina, Indiana. Now we're working on California. So we know this is an issue across the country. It's so important that folks have access to voting. Like I said, the power of the disability vote is huge. We're a really big group, but we got to make sure that the system's accessible.
And are there certain regions or states or cities that are, so to speak, trending in the right direction? Do you have sort of favorites that you think of now that you like to cite about what best in class looks like in responsiveness to the kind of impact litigation?
Yeah, in states like North Carolina, where there was a system in place for overseas military service people to vote online. We've got that system now available to people who are blind in North Carolina. So that is one example. Also, being a national organization, when we get a precedent in one state, we're able to use that to help advocate in other states and move the ball forward. And that's also very much helpful to judges who are trying to decide these cases. They're looking at what other jurisdictions did and for precedent.
Ladies and gentlemen, again today on the Caring Economy, I'm really happy to have Rebecca Williford with us. She's the president and CEO of the Disability Rights Advocates. Can you tell us here, as in the occasion of the 30th anniversary now, I guess it is, for the ADA, how far have we come? What's your sort of pulse take?
We're at 34 years this year. Okay. We're celebrating the 34th anniversary of the ADA and the 31st anniversary of DRA, which I will tell you more about a very exciting celebration on November 13th that you can attend in person or virtually. So, when I look at where we've gone and where we've been, boy, have we come a long way. But oh my gosh, we have so far to go. And, some of it is not even some of it is sort of, underpinnings of, attitudes and ableism that's in society. I mean, ableism is alive and well, and it's society needs to get better at recognizing it. I mean, a lot of folks may not even be familiar with that term, but it's, recognizing and fighting against it, because I think attitudes are some of the greatest barriers to moving society forward and making us more accessible. And they don't cost anything to fix. You just take, education. So like for an example, I'm a trial lawyer by training, and ADA coordinators at two different courts have, when I've been called for jury duty, have told me that I'm too disabled to be on the jury,
Really?
and that literally people like me shouldn't be on juries. And they've taken it a step further and given me a lifetime exemption in a letter from jury duty in those courts. And that's
Huh.
completely counter to how our justice system should operate if we have some courts that are out of the gate turning away jurors, potential jurors with disability, just because of their disability on the basis of disability. And I think it's very much rooted in sort of an antiquated, what we call as the, charity model of disability. We've moved beyond that. Disabled people are empowered. We have, July is all about Disability Pride Month. We have our Disability Pride flag, and we have come a really long way. And of course, like if every disabled person is on their own journey, and if you've met one disabled person, you've met one. But as a movement, like there is such a, we are in such a different place as a society. So, that I would like to imagine that we can start recognizing ableism and talking about it and fighting against it.
Could you do a little myth busting with us? I think most people are decent and want to live and let live in this country, but I'm sure that the ignorance and a naivete out there sometimes presents you with sort of common or frequent stupid questions or expectations or assumptions. And I excuse me, I wonder if you might share a couple of examples that are easy to be addressed, right? If someone's just aware, like if you see someone who's disabled, how do you approach them? Like some people don't know what to call them or how to say it. I'm not saying that has to be an example, but what are some of the myths out there that people you've observed or your organization has observed that could be addressed more readily in a statement here even?
Yeah, so there's a lot of myths. There's also, I'm going to plug, I have this on my desk. This is a book called Demystifying Disability, What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally. It is written by one of our board members, Emily Liddell, and this book is incredible. Emily published this book very recently, and for folks who aren't familiar with disability, or even if you are, I have learned things by reading this book. It talks through all those things. You probably noticed I'm using the words disabled and person with disability interchangeably. There are people who really prefer the person first language, so people with disabilities, and then there's also people who, like I'm very proud of my disability. Disabled is something I'm proud to say.
Yeah.
The community doesn't agree because we're a very diverse community with a lot of viewpoints. So I think, you can never go wrong by just ask the person first, what they need. I think don't make assumptions. Don't assume that you see a person, going down the street and they're approaching a door. Don't assume they need help with the door. I have my own system for opening doors. When people grab it, it actually, interrupts that. And I'm like more likely to bump into the door or something like that. So just saying like anything I can do to help, seeing people as people first,
Yeah.
seeing disability is a natural part of the human experience.
Yeah.
Not something to be afraid of or pitied, but something that could happen to anybody at any time.
I would think like the juror example you gave, the logic behind that, did someone think you're disabled, therefore you can't show up physically, or that you're not capable mentally? I mean, what logic was given if you can share behind that kind of process?
There wasn't much logic shared.
Really?
um, so and I said, I just want to be clear for my job. I'm a lawyer and I go to court and I can do trials as a lawyer, and I can win them. Um, so
Yeah.
I just want to say that I think it could be a juror. Uh,
Oh,
But and it's like I know if this is happening to me, like I also am, aware of my privilege as somebody who is an attorney. Like, I can only imagine what is happening to people who haven't had advantages that I've had in my life. It worries me just to wonder what you don't know.
can you say about solutions? I'm thinking again, the technology point, the advancements over the past 30 plus years. Is technology really helping, or is it sometimes surprisingly hindering the advancement for people with disabilities?
So technology has an incredible potential to open doors like nobody's business and make society so much more accessible to people with disabilities when it's accessible. But when technology is not, and when we're talking about that, we're usually talking about people who use different types of assistive technology. So somebody who's dyslexic, who's using a screen reader to sort of read all the print to them. Somebody who's blind for the same reason. People with different manual dexterity disabilities are also using it. But if, things like websites and, kiosks that you use to check in at medical appointments and to buy groceries, if if those systems aren't made to be accessible from the beginning, then you've left out millions of people. Like I always think back to sort of me as a teenager and like sitting through PE class and being told, "Oh, just sit there and watch. We'll give you credit." Um, so, and we've got to do better and we've got to get folks included. So technology has, so can open so many doors. We're looking at things like autonomous vehicles. There's incredible potential there if it's done right, especially if, there's a lot of people who can't drive because of their disability. Is that accessible to people with disabilities, and are we including them? And, I think they've been left out along the way on many fronts.
The technology makes me think about the private sector. You mentioned earlier Starbucks. We met at Goldman Sachs. I wonder, are there certain corporations, industries, or organizations that you want to give a shout out to as really being on top of this and being good allies for you?
Yeah, so in addition to Starbucks, who again fixed their counter heights, we were working with Little People of America, and we got those complaints, and they really sort of jumped on it. That was many years ago. DRA is going to be giving an award to Netflix this year. Speaking of technology, it is our second annual nationwide gala. And Netflix has done so much for the disability community. They're, are providing captioning for their videos. Because of some work with DRA, they provide audio description on for people who are blind. And for folks that aren't familiar with audio description, when you're watching something and there's a scene but no dialogue, but usually something really important is happening. If you're blind, you're just sitting there and you have no idea what's happening. But if audio description tracks are included, it'll tell you exactly what's happening. And the blind person is on the equal playing field. They're not like poking the person next to them in the theater saying, "What's going on? What's going on?" So we're so excited to be honoring Netflix at our gala this year. And it's going to be November 13th. And because we are DRA and we're big and bold, we did this last year when we turned 30 years old, and we're doing it again this year. But we will be live in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco all at the same time. And we will be live streamed, and it'll be kind of like New Year's Eve. We will have our main stages in San Francisco and New York City. We'll be throwing the mic back and forth. We'll have honorees in both locations. So it's going to be really exciting time. You can find more info on dralegal.org about our gala.
You read my mind. So say it again. So you want information on the event or just getting more involved or aware of DRA? What is the website, please?
So our website is dralegal.org. You can also find us on Instagram at dralegal, and my personal Instagram is rebecca.williford.dra. So we'll also be honoring Yannick Benjamin. He is a sommelier in New York City. who uses a wheelchair, and he has really sort of disrupted the restaurant industry in a good way with disability. He's opened a restaurant in Harlem called Contento, which is really awesome. You should check out if you've not been there. It's super accessible. You could be a bartender and be in a wheelchair and be on the other side of the bar. It's really he's done a really, really nice job with that. And he does a lot of other things in the sort of wine and restaurant industry.
My last question to you is about pearls of wisdom. I'm mindful of time here, but in your vast career and life experience, what sort of lessons have you learned, or mantras you have, or pearls of wisdom?
I have two. Number one is trust yourself. Number two is do your homework. Be the most prepared person in the room, and you will not fail.
Those are great tips. And did you get that from your parents as well, or that you just?
I've gotten that from various folks over the years, and it's kind of an amalgamation of different things.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Rebecca Williford for joining us today. She is the president and CEO of Disability Rights Advocates, only national nonprofit center for legal services focused on disability rights and impact litigation. The fact that you're doing it with such impact, it's why you have it in the name, right? It is that, and it's societal change. It's moving mountains, and you're doing it. And I'm looking forward to following your website and all that's going on around the anniversary later this summer for the ADA. And then also I'll see if I can come to your fall gala.
Absolutely. Please, please. We would love to have you there. We also have an e-newsletter you folks can sign up for on our website. We don't send too many, so you won't be too bombarded, but if you want
Cool.
to stay in touch with what's happening.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Caring Economy, Rebecca Williford.
Thank you, Toby.